Yeah.
What do you make of what appears to me the essential argument of the Declaration that if a people have suffered enough, they have the right to wrest control from their existing government?
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things about the Declaration to me is that it makes not only that argument, but it is cognizant of the fact that different peoples, different cultures will react to similar stimuli in radically different ways.
Okay.
By
And sorry, just swing that mic just a little bit closer so it's
yeah.
more pointed at
And
you.
and what I mean by that is that at the beginning of the Declaration of Independence, the passage we're most familiar with, we hold these truths to be self-evident, and so on. Um, it makes universal abstract statements,
Hmm.
but the way that sentence actually begins is we hold these truths to be self-evident. Not every people holds these truths to be self-evident. And throughout the document, there's a distinction that comes up from time to time. It's never made thematic in any sentence, but there's a distinction between a free people, and then the implication is there such a thing as an unfree people, a slavish people, and I think that distinction is not just between people who are currently in a state of freedom versus slavery, but it's pointing to the character of the people.
Oh,
Again, in one of the grievances against the king, um, the document complains about the king dissolving representative houses, colonial legislatures, for resisting with manly firmness his actions.
yes.
And again, that's a characteristic, maybe that's a virtue, manly firmness, that some individuals have and some don't. And I think the claim of the Declaration is some peoples have, some cultures have, and some do not. And so my reading of the Declaration of Independence is, yes, it sounds right to me as a matter of principle that a people has a right to resist tyranny, and perhaps at a certain point, that would involve actually, in the language of the Declaration, altering or abolishing their form of government or dissolving the bands that connect them with the source of tyrannical power. That seems to me right as a matter of principle. We're driven by our nature and also by the commands of God to pursue justice, and resisting tyranny is a form of resisting injustice. But I think that there's another level of the Declaration which is really fascinating to me, which is what are the cultural conditions of for a people to be willing to recognize injustice as injustice and willing to stand up to it.
Okay. I want to come back to that.
Yeah.
Can we just make sure that we're all, in this instance, literally on the same page? It seems to me that the Declaration, as written, has four main parts. Does that track basically an introduction that says, "Oh, the world ought to know what we have to say about this.
Mm-hmm.
Here's our basic argument. Here are our complaints that justify our basic argument." And then the fourth part, it appears to me, is the therefore we, as the representatives of these several states, declare ourselves independent. Is that, do we have that, do I have that correctly broken down?
Yes, and so although I would say it's equally valid and interesting to describe it in another way that I think is complementary to what you
Okay.
just did.
Sure.
You described the first sentence, so when in the course of human events it becomes necessary, et cetera,
Hmm.
as sort of introductory statement, like we are going to make an announcement here. The second sentence and following, we hold these truths, and up until the point where the document says the history of the present King of Great Britain has been a history of great violations, et cetera. You're describing that as sort of the statement of the major premise of the argument. The grievances is the minor premise.
Yep.
Like our condition is actually meeting what we're describing, and then the conclusion of the argument being, therefore, we're separated. I think that's right. I also think that that first sentence should get more attention than it often does. Right. So the very first sentence, before the one we're all familiar with, before the self-evident truths, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people, we're not talking about individuals yet, but we're talking about communities, right? For one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them to another, and to assume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them. Under those conditions, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. Two things about that I find really fascinating.
Yeah.
The first is that the focus is on the people, not persons. The focus is on I think you could substitute the term nation there, or culture, some kind of self-conscious political unit, a polity, a city or polis in the ancient sense. We're not talking about individuals yet. And of course, individual rights are sort of the pride of America, right? We love talking about our individual rights. But I think even in the Declaration of Independence, we wait to speak of individuals. First, we speak of whole cultures to which they belong, by which they are formed. So that's one thing about that opening sentence. The other is that it says, we're going to declare the causes which impel us to the separation. And what comes next, as you pointed out, is the major premise, not the grievances. The causes that impel us to the separation are not that the king has been really cruel, unjust, mean to us, or that he cooperated with Parliament, which is overreaching, and so on and so forth. Those are causes in a certain sense. But the most profound causes are the fact that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that we're the kind of people who take these self-evident truths about natural rights and the right of the people to form and abolish governments and so on, that we take that stuff for granted. And I think that's the deepest cause of the American Revolution, because you could say, look, there have been many, and there continue to be many peoples in the world who are oppressed by tyrants, by foreign nations, etc. They don't all react the same way. In fact, this helps make sense of when you go back to the American Revolution and you actually look at the grievances, it's not that bad, right? Okay, you've got to pay like a tax on some imported goods. That's annoying. Okay. The king is messing around with your legislative institutions. Okay. The individual people in America are not enslaved, and yet they speak consistently in the decade before the Declaration of this train of events as an attempt to enslave them. They are a very prickly people. They are very suspicious of any kind of attempt to usurp their traditional right to govern themselves. And so they are very, I don't think it's fair to say trigger happy, but right. They are willing to respond vigorously and in their language with manly firmness to any kind of encroachment on their rights and on their traditions of self-government. And that is not the case with every people. That is not the case with every culture. I think different people have different thresholds in terms of what they're used to. And when you go back and you read the founders at that time, and then you read the couple of generations afterwards reflecting on the generation of 1776, they will say very consistently, this is a people who saw tyranny coming down the pike. They were not actually enslaved. They were not actually being tyrannized over in a profound way, but they saw a tendency, and they wanted to guard the good thing that they had, which was a tradition of self-government. They started to see that being threatened, and they pushed back. They spoke up. They organized themselves into continental congresses. They said in the First and Second Continental Congress, their early grievances against the king and Parliament, and their addresses to the British people. They say we are doing the historically, traditionally British thing, which is that we're enumerating our rights and we're petitioning the king or just announcing to the world or to Parliament that our rights are being violated. And this is a grand old, centuries long tradition in British history. There's a great interview with Captain Levi Preston, who's some guy from Danvers, Massachusetts. He's just a farmer who's a Minuteman who goes to Concord on the 19th of April, 18th of April, right? And shoots redcoats, right? And there's a great interview with him that a historian named Mellon Chamberlain later in the 19th century conducts and then reports when he's speaking to the Sons of the American Revolution. And Captain Levi Preston is asked by the interviewer, why did you go to the Concord fight that day? Were you being oppressed? He said, no, I didn't feel any oppressions. Well, weren't you annoyed about the tea tax? He says, no, no one drank the tea. The boys threw it all overboard. I didn't pay any tax on the tea because it was destroyed. What about the stamp act? He's I never paid a penny of tax on that stuff, right? He didn't directly experience all of these things that we looked at. And then the interviewer asks him, well, weren't you reading John Locke and Algernon Sidney. And weren't you sort of studying the eternal principles of liberty from these Enlightenment political philosophers? And Captain Levi Preston's response is never heard of him. We only read the Almanac and the Bible and the Psalms and so on. And so the interviewer is sort of flustered. He says, "So why did you go? Why did you go to Concord that day? Why did you shoot redcoats? Like, what was it over?" And Levi Preston's response is, "We had always governed ourselves, and they didn't mean that we should. They intended that we would no longer govern ourselves." That is a very particular, and this, so that's not to say that the leaders of the revolution were not thinking about Enlightenment political philosophy, and obviously they were, and they were at the highest level. John Adams, Sam Adams, and their brethren up and down the Atlantic, they were thinking about the acts of Parliament and all of that. The common man, however, just recognized the redcoats are coming to take away our tradition of govern ourselves, and I don't like that. I want to make sure that that doesn't happen, and I want to. And it's not so much that I'm laboring under oppression right now, but I see into the future that this will go in a bad direction. That my liberty to govern myself, my liberty to be a part of a self-governing community, is going to be taken away unless we put a stop to it.
We're nipping something in the bud.
We are nipping something in the bud, and I think that that's a very different situation than a people who is oppressed and then overthrows their oppressors. And I just think our character as Americans, we've actually never, we had not at that time, and arguably never, although we could talk about more recent history, we've never been oppressed in that really egregious and severe way, in the way that the Russian people under Bolshevism were oppressed, or some really extreme example like that. So that's a very long way of saying that I think even the first two sentences of the Declaration of Independence, when in the course of human events becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands, what's the causes? The first cause and the most profound cause is that we're the kind of people who take these things for granted. We're the kind of people who have a very elevated notion of our own rights given to us by God and through nature. Not every people is like that, and we're making this statement of identity that we're the kind of people who will react to the prospect of tyranny in this way.
Interesting. Would you argue then that the American Revolution is distinct from other revolutions in history in this sense, that it was declared early, so to speak? It wasn't overthrow oppressors. It was these potential oppressors are going to have no further opportunity to enact the basically incipient oppression.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I would. And I should qualify that, right? Because you look at the history, and the conventional history is correct, right? The Stamp Act, 1765, sort of, Parliament is trying to capitalize on French and Indian War, make the American colonists pay for it. Parliament, is almost a century into this era of parliamentary supremacy after the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Parliament is really flexing its own muscles within the British Empire, within the British regime, and Parliament is becoming a much more aggressive wielder of power than has ever been the case in English history. And they choose to pick on the American colonists, right? It's actually, for the 10 years before 1776, it's not the king. The king is guilty because of omission of acts, not commission. He's guilty because he's not restraining Parliament from misgoverning us, from trying to misgovern us, and they ought not to govern us in many respects. So all that's true, right? And Stamp Act 1765, we make in the First Continental, or the Stamp Act Congress, we make protests against that. What happens in 1766? The Stamp Act is repealed by Parliament. Like, it worked. The Stamp Act Congress worked in 1765, but it didn't, because at the same time, Parliament passes, I'm forgetting what it's called, is it the Regulatory Act or something like that? They pass another act declaring, they retract the Stamp Act, which is taxation on all kinds of products, including like legal documents and just things you need to sort of run a society in America. They retract that, but then they pass another act asserting that they have the right to do this. And in fact, the phrase that they use is that they have the right to legislate in all cases whatsoever over the colonies. That's a terrifying phrase to a people who understand a tradition of liberty and who have a sense of limited government, and even who have a sense of natural law and common law and divine law as putting limits on what humans can do, to make laws in all cases whatsoever. And again, that's the direct quote that triggers the American colonists, and then they keep repeating in the decade afterwards when they're listing their grievances. In principle, that is Parliament asserting that they could treat the American colonists in whatever way they wanted. Not just that they could put another tax on them if they wanted. They tried that, and they do that. And there's the Intolerable Acts and everything that happens in the 1760s and 70s. And so I don't want to say that there are no grievances. There are grievances. They're right there in the Declaration of Independence. They're well enumerated. You can find them in many other documents. But I also want to point out that we were not a people enslaved for some period of time who then broke our chains. We started to have a distant government overstep the bounds, and we pushed back and we pushed back, and they kept pushing, and we pushed back and they kept pushing. And then we said, here we are, 1776. In fact, what we said is 1775, the Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. This is after Lexington and Concord. We commissioned George Washington to go to Massachusetts to take command of the Massachusetts militia and others, and sort of make this new thing called the Continental Army. And this is the origin of the American Army, which we just celebrated the 250th anniversary with a big shiny parade in Washington that a lot of people didn't enjoy. Right. What Congress is doing, what the Continental Congress is doing at that point, is saying we are going to authorize a colony-wide army to shoot redcoats because we want to stay in the British Empire. And there's a full year between June 1775 and 76 where we are conducting a war against the British Army so that we can stay in the British Empire under proper terms. That's remarkable, right? So there are oppressions, but we are pushing back against them, and we are not letting ourselves slip into slavery for a period of time and then deciding to throw off our oppressors, or then finding a way to throw off our oppressors. We actually just didn't get to that depth in the 1770s.
The self-defense was robust. Aggressive self-defense.
It was. And it took a while. Like, part of this is that it just takes a while for the representatives from all the colonies to become convinced that we need independence and not just some kind of complaint and then wait for the king to respond and it'll all work out, right? Mm-hmm. There was that element of more loyalist inclined congressmen in the Continental Congress. And it takes a while for them to be converted. But it's not just that. We also are, I think, genuinely trying to find a way to remain in the British Empire, but under better terms than had become the case. As the Declaration says, it takes a lot for a people to throw off the forms to which they are accustomed, right? And that was us. That was the Americans in the 1760s and 70s. It actually took a while for us to think outside the box of being British subjects in America and begin to think of ourselves as a people that had some connection with England and now no longer has that connection.
We're in our post-English phase.
That's right.
We're in our post-empire phase.
Yes.
It's interesting that I believe it was perhaps Dave Smith who brought forth this idea that representative bodies are typically going to be composed of, I think he uses the term plutocrats, but basically people who have some measure of wealth and power in their own person, mm-hmm. right? And so that it actually will, in an odd way, it actually falls to the king to defend the common man. Was this something I was talking with you about at one point, perhaps?
Perhaps.
Okay.
I'm not sure the specific reference you're making, but I could phrase that, and it has been phrased by others as, right. It takes an alliance between the king and the people to defeat the oligarchs, or something like that.
Yes.
So Aristotle says the one, the few, and the many, right? And then we can describe those and give those many different names. But you could have different combinations of regimes, and it's in the interest of the king, the monarch, at his best, is to secure the common good of all. And who is most likely, if you have a robust monarchy, who is most likely to try to usurp him? It's not really the people; it's actually the oligarchs. It's the few who have more means at their disposal than the common people. And so, if you do have that kind of setup, and the king wants to remain king, it's in his interest to treat the people as well as possible, and also find a way for the nobles to sort of fit into the regime and so on. But
Right. It, but it seems interesting to me that you're basically describing parliament of the the parliament of the British Empire, right? Because it started acting as the parliament of the British Empire,
correct.
and not just the parliament of
England and Scotland and
yeah,
yeah,
exactly, of the United Kingdom, perhaps.
right.
Yeah.
And so that is how by the mid 1770s, that is how the Americans are thinking about it. Right? They are thinking about um, Parliament as the legislative body of the British Isles, um, and the General Court of Massachusetts as the legislative body of Massachusetts, and the House of Burgesses as the legislative body of Virginia, right? And like whatever the name is for the legislature of Pennsylvania, being, I don't know if it had a funny name or not, as the other ones do,
Sure.
and of New York and so on. And by the 1770s, you have the colonists through Congress making these arguments that it is both a natural right and a traditional right of ourselves as Englishmen. They love like weaving those together in the 1770s. Like it's this and this. It's nature and tradition, right? It's reason and custom saying the same thing. We the people have a right to govern themselves, to have their own legislative body. We all happen to be under the king for various reasons. And so they wind up seeing, yes, the king is in England, but the king is the king of the British Empire. And the parliament's in England, but it's the parliament of and for Britain. And maybe it has a special relation, a special prerogative over us because it is still the mother country.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but but the king is the parent,
Yep.
and really the parliament is like the older sibling who's abusing the younger sibling. And like
Yes.
you go to your dad and ask the older sibling to back off, or you try to push him back yourself. And if you know the king does not restrain the older sibling or the parliament, at a certain point you say, I have to make a separation
Yes.
from the family, though I don't want to.
So it's interesting that the Continental Congress really saw itself as being the same type of body as Parliament,
Yeah.
which means that the first and foremost, they saw them acting in the same role. And it's when they were not given the autonomy to act in that role that then they decided, okay, our objection is actually to the rule of the emperor, if you will, because the emperor is not protecting the rights of the sort of islands of autonomy found throughout his empire.
That's right. That's right. And maybe there's an alternative history that could have happened, that the British Empire solves the crisis of the 1760s and 70s by the king restraining Parliament, working out some kind of deal where there's understood rights that are and privileges that are acceptable to everyone. And I think a lot of American patriots who we today think of as revolutionaries and founders and so on, a lot of them in the early 1770s would have been very happy with that. Um, and in a certain way, it's a tragedy, right? That as what Winston Churchill called the speaking peoples of the world were divided at that point.
Yes.
Obviously, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, didn't suffer that same kind of rupture at that time. They've sort of drifted apart, but they're still part of the Commonwealth. They're still the King of England is king of those other nations as well. Yeah,
Okay, so in a certain way, the American Revolution is like an unwilling divorce, right? You've left me with no choice. And that's what the Declaration of Independence actually is.
That's right.
That we are left with no choice.
which is so strange, right? But that is its plain meaning, right? that the causes that impel us to the separation, they say at the end that we're bound by necessity.
Yes.
And it's, as you laid out, there's this kind of train of logic that given these premises and then given this circumstance, you can't but find this conclusion, which is that we are in fact separated. We're not doing this as an act of will, but we're just recognizing the reality that we are no longer have these ties binding us.
But the point you're bringing to the table is that we should recognize historically that while the language of the Declaration says we have no choice, your point is that a polity in a way, always has a choice. Are they going to be a submissive polity, or are they going to be a polity with a policy of aggressive self-defense?
Mhm.
And and perhaps what's unique about the American polity is that they did make the choice to be to act with the vigor of self-assertiveness that they did,
Mhm.
even though there's always, in fact, the choice to roll over and submit to encroachments.
That's right. And only a certain kind of person will recognize in this situation I have no choice.
Hmm.
One in one direction or another, right? In this situation I have no choice but to submit to oppression. Or in this situation I have no choice. Of course they do have a choice, but this is the way we phrase it to
Right.
ourselves like it behooves me as a
Mm.
man to respond in this manful way.
Yes.
It behooves me as a culture, it behooves us to stand up for our rights and we can do no other.
Yeah.
Would I don't know if you want to go here, but would that be morally correct then? As in, like, I don't know what kind of structure this would fall under, if it would be just war theory or something else, but would that like be morally permissible to like say, I see tyranny coming, I'm going to say no now, than waiting to actually have tyranny to overthrow?
Yeah, great question. Um, I think the
Because I
yeah.
just was thinking with like a an instance with like the Second Amendment, it would be more prudent and defending yourself to expose your gun to show someone that you're armed if they look like you're going to threaten you.
Mhm,
Then until you start having bullets fly at you,
mhm,
you'd still be defending yourself, which is correct. So from that
mhm.
perspective, it seems like we did the right thing.
Yes, and
Okay.
that's a good analogy, and I think there are analogs to that showing your gun, right? We have repeated declarations from the American people organized politically in the Continental Congresses, First Continental Congress and Second, as well as all of the individual actors in the legislatures of the different colonies in the run up to 1776 of saying, no, we think this is unjust. We think you are starting to treat us as slaves. We do not want to be treated as slaves. What you are doing, we are interpreting in this way. We're willing to resist. We're willing to respond. I mean, the First Continental Congress before Lexington and Concord, right? This is fall of 74, right? That the First Continental Congress is meeting, I think October of 1774. They agree to something called the Continental Association, which is essentially a 13 colonies wide um, boycott of British imported goods. Right? They're saying you are putting such onerous taxes on us and customs and so on, and restrictions on our own commercial activity. You know what? We are going to give up many of the nice luxuries that you are selling in our markets, and that we know that your merchants depend on our markets to sell. And they go through, and it's a pretty exhaustive list. It's good reading, preparing for the semi-quincentennial. But it's funny. It's also like we're not going to drink tea anymore. Okay, remember that one. We're going to give up Madeira wine, which I don't know if you've had. It's really good though. A wine from the Madeira Islands is still really good. It was like the favored drink of the American founders. They say we're not going to buy that anymore, even though this is the only way to get it. I think maybe the only wine really available in the colonies at that time, right? They go through a whole list. Like when we have funerals, we are going to have moderate mourning. We're not going to buy little black gloves for our women because that is actually rewarding the British textile industry. And we're going to give up all of these little things to send a message to the British that we are serious, that your plan of treating us as a kind of tax farm is not going to work. And they do that, and they implement that, and that really annoys the British and the British regime and the British merchants, who are largely in charge of Parliament at that point. And
The British merchant class
yeah,
was influential in Parliament, or perhaps one and the same as Parliament.
yep.
And so all of a sudden they see an entire market drying up.
And this is right. This is the age of the dominance of capitalism. Right, 1776. It's the Declaration of Independence. It's also Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, right? You have the manufacturing and commercial class becoming ascendant in Britain, and there's a lot of good that comes with that, and a lot of bad that comes with that. With any kind of great socioeconomic transformation, there's a lot of disruption, and there's of course a competition for power and you want your sort of new commercial class to be calling the shots in the empire, and you've got the East India Company and even many of the colonies being invested in by the merchants. In any case, all of which is to say, there's a very long run up of clear signals, and I think it's important for this reasoning that they are politically organized, right? If you have people resisting on a kind of ad hoc basis and people grumbling and occasional acts of violence against the authorities, it's really hard to discern in that scenario like what the will of the people is. But the Americans, as sort of good Anglo-Americans, they always had this talent for organizing, right? Tocqueville later describes the American art of association. We come up with clubs and voluntary associations and political parties, and we have the township, and we're always organizing ourselves socially and politically to express our common will as a people. And so we've been doing that for centuries, for a century and a half by the time of the revolution. And specifically in reaction to parliamentary overreach, we are doing that with very clear signals for a decade. So on the one hand, to respond to Tom's question about is this morally justified? Yes, in part because we're showing our gun and we're making it very clear that if you want to come closer to us, you should start communicating with us and reach an agreement because we're interpreting your motion towards us as a threat, right? On the other hand, I would say there's another dimension to this, which is we have a responsibility to our forefathers and to our descendants, right? The preamble to the Constitution says we're instituting this Constitution to secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, right? So to ourselves, to our forefathers, and ourselves now, and to those who come after us. And so that element of anticipation, I think you could make an argument that there's a duty to anticipate things getting worse. There's a duty to anticipate if we are complacent, this will turn into real tyranny, and a duty to ourselves as dignified creatures who are supposed to do God's business in the world and live in accordance with the nature He's made us in. And a duty to our children that we want to hand on a free, prosperous, well-ordered society to them, and we think that this current tendency is working against that. So that doesn't justify you in going and assassinating the king or something like that, right? Or performing acts of terrorism against the British people. But I think from those you could say there is a moral justification for vigorously resisting, even to the point of violent self-defense. But it is a defensive war, right? It's a self-defensive war.
Okay, that's very interesting because I've heard some commenters and thought leaders that say we should never have broken away, like the grievances weren't that bad. But putting it in that light, where it's like where we're stopping something that England already said, we kind of own you in every way, and it's just our time when we're going to enforce that. We're saying, well, no, we don't want any part of that, which makes total sense. And with it being not only yourselves, but your posterity that you're thinking of, it makes a lot of sense to stop it now. Like I think that's kind of like a lot of the arguments we're having now with like about AI and stuff. It's like, well, should we cap it now before it gets out of hand, or do we just let it go and then deal with it later? So it makes a lot of sense to figure out the problem now and take care of it.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge that the grievances were not that bad, but that's part of my argument. Is that the grievances were not that bad, and the fact that we did not let it get to that point is a sign of the kind of people, the kind of culture we were then, and should be something we're actually proud of. And I think that's also a component to the revolution lacking some of the excesses that, say, the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution have and exhibit. Right? You have the French Revolution, in which there are really grievous grievances for many decades, arguably centuries, that the very poor in France are suffering under, and that in no way excuses how they treat the rich when they get the upper hand. It doesn't, but it does explain the kind of barbaric acts of violence that are committed against the upper classes when the monarchy is overthrown. And you could say similar things about the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia or many other revolutions. A long oppressed people is suffering and they have festering wounds and resentments, and then many of them vent those on their former oppressors. We did not quite have that situation. There were loyalists who were mistreated, whose property was destroyed or stolen, who were murdered, right? These things actually did happen. History's messy. But I just don't think it's comparable to another nation which actually was suffering under tyranny for decades or centuries, right? Thank God we avoided that. We didn't have 400 years of slavery to Pharaoh, and then I mean that's a different scenario than like leave. But we did have an impending tyranny that we manfully resisted, and then decided, no, we do not want to continue in relationship.